Yeah, I used it for the first time for a nonprofit commons talk about back in November, and it takes a little bit of time. If you what I typically what worked best for me was to click the Speakeasy HUD, and what I actually did was I numbered my Speakeasy HUD with extra little with extra little equal signs to go between slides, and then I would hit that,
Oh,
and then I'd also make sure I'd have it say slide 1, and then that way, or I might even, actually what I might have done was this, slide 2, and then even though those were extra clicks, it helped me anchor to each slide as I was doing it.
that's awesome. Okay. Okay, so I might try and do that for this one too, because um, I gave Natalia the Speakeasy HUD because I was like,
Oh,
here,
it's okay.
thank you, and then
Explorer
I'll
asked me
just
to help her too, so
really, because it's
yeah.
just I'm reading from notes and stuff at the same time, and then yeah, I found out the last time when I was using it, I'm like looking at too many things, I think, and so that was a problem. Um, anyways, should I go ahead and start?
Yeah.
Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I just want to thank everybody for coming to my talk. I see some old faces and new faces here too. For those of you that are interested, I'm going to be presenting this talk again at the Virtual World's Best Practices in Education Conference in Second Life this Friday from 11 o'clock to 11:50 SLT. So, also, if you like talks like this, there are going to be 4 full days of them starting this Wednesday at the conference. So Stephen is actually a mentor there. He can even tell you more information about VWBPE if you're interested. And also, Star, Natalia, and I are going to be doing a talk on Thursday about Meeting of the Minds if you had missed it last week. So please keep in mind, though, like the talk that I'm doing today is catered to educators at the conference. So even though a lot of you may not be teachers, I will be kind of using that language because a lot of teachers are going to be in the audience. So, and it's really geared towards people who want to incorporate some of these teaching practices and some of this theory into what they're currently doing for teaching. Now, during the talk, if you have any questions, you can hit the cue board, which is right above me, right above my head, and then I will answer them when I have a brief break or a pause. Secondly, I'm not going to be able to pay attention to local chat because I'm busy looking at the slides. So if you are putting any questions there, I may miss them. So it's probably best to actually hit the cue board so that I can hear it and I know that somebody is queuing a question there, okay? And so yeah, hang on to those questions until, I have a chance in between to actually answer them. Also, you can get a link to the slides. I'm actually going to, let me see, send out a note card. And in theory, this should go to everybody. And in that note card is actually a link to my slides on Google Doc, just in case you're having trouble seeing them in World. And let me just copy that to the local chat for you as well. So that is here. Okay. Now that note card actually has references which you'll actually see at the bottom of some of my slides. So in other words, if it's something that really interests you, you can download the reference sheet and that will point you to some of those sources. I tried to kind of stay bare on some of those references, but later on, you can always shoot me an email and say, hey, Blue, do you have any more information on such and such? And more than likely I do, because this is actually part of my doctoral studies. So I have a lot of information on this in case you were curious about learning these things. So anyways, for this talk, let me just go over the overview for a second. We're going to start with educational trends in the information age. I'll start talking about the 3 models of pedagogy, modern learning theory, advantages to online education, this educational design model called a community of inquiry, leveraging learning theory in virtual space, and finally, the limitations and hindrances to online and virtual spaces. Now, some trends. Why are we moving towards online education, and why is this becoming such a popular thing? There's actually 4 trends that are really responsible for that. The first trend is the decreased cost in technology and the increased accessibility of the internet. As computers get cheaper and internet services become more widespread, more and more people are able to incorporate virtual pieces into their lives. So it's almost natural then to incorporate education and educational practices into this as well. Secondly, there is this belief that online is better than face-to-face instruction. Now, studies have actually shown that this is not necessarily true. In fact, what it actually says is that the effectiveness of teaching depends more on the tools and the appropriateness of those tools to online education and learning objectives than it is where it's done, whether it's face-to-face or online. And then third, cost effectiveness. You can teach more students with less costly materials. An example of this would be, you may have heard of massive online open courses or MOOCs, where hundreds of students can be taught with just one instructor. Another thing is people are using online time in even K through 12 education as extra instructional time without needing to hire extra teachers, because kids can do this in a computer lab and they can receive instruction. So it's cost effective. And then lastly, there is this effective instructional delivery of online materials. There's advantages to online spaces like videos and demos and things like that I'll talk about, which can really enhance your class, be it whether or not it's face-to-face or fully online. Let's take a look at some of our choices currently on the web. So hopefully when you take a look at that slide, you're probably going to at least recognize one of the things that we use, right? More than likely, you probably can recognize other sites that you use as well. Now, I'm willing to bet that you're familiar with some of these, and you'll notice that they all have several features in common. These sites allow us to connect and network with other people. They each have unique ways in which people can share information from their professional and private lives. And then also, each site connects people to these sources of knowledge, different perspectives, views, and information. Essentially, we're now in the information age, what some people call the wevolution. We're in an era now where we can customize things to our tastes, co-create, collaborate, and share with other people. Depending on where we go digitally, there's spaces for us to participate and create knowledge, meet, and network. In other words, and for some of you, you may remember this, information, collaboration, and even patterns of power have now been decentralized and redistributed among users. Apps are a great example of how the revolution has become incorporated into our lives, with developers of all ages, expertise, and abilities creating useful products that are shared and purchased by other users. Now, there's a problem with this, though. And here's the problem. Our society is entering an information age where just everybody is beginning to connect, collaborate, and access new sources of knowledge. However, our educational practices are still stuck in the industrial age. So let me explain this by looking at our general assumptions when it comes to teaching. Specifically, when it comes to philosophies of teaching and educational pedagogy. Pedagogy, by the way, is basically explaining the means or the methods of teaching or imparting knowledge or instruction. So there's three basic groups that we can consider pedagogy. You can think of this in a typical classroom, okay? So here, the first model is kind of the classic model, and I would argue that this is probably how most people understand teaching to be. Now, in order to explain these three models, I'm going to use a metaphor of food to kind of help you. So, in this model, the teacher is like the chef, okay? And they're the expert. They prepare the food, and then they serve it to the students on an empty plate. So the underlying assumption to this is that a student's mind is empty, and it's the job of the teacher to fill it. There's also the assumption that the teacher knows more than the student. Now, the generative model is this philosophy that students come with knowledge, and they're going to use what they come with to research and co-construct to make new knowledge and new meanings, while the teacher guides. In this philosophy, everyone, all students, are bringing something to the table. So in a way, you can think of this as a potluck, where everybody is bringing something to the table that's really unique. And then we all take our plates, and then we fill our plates with the food, and then we go back. But the other thing that's important about this generative knowledge is that everybody fills their plate in a different way. Nobody gets the same thing. They get what they need or what they take from the table. Okay? Now, the third model is called the transformative model, and I would claim it's probably the most difficult one to do, and it's also the one that I see least often in formal education. Another term for that people may be familiar with is this is also called critical pedagogy. In this model, the roles of the student and the teacher are often switched, or they move fluidly among a community of learners, such that everybody in the classroom takes turns being an expert in the learning community. And the intention is that all participants, including the teacher, leaves the class not only knowing more about the discipline, but also about each other and themselves. Now, for those of you that might be familiar with critical theory and who might want to read more about it, this is a model in philosophy most cited by Paulo Freire in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. If you don't know about the book, don't worry about it or look it up. It's actually a pretty good read. Now, in this kind of metaphor, the idea here is that everybody comes in as a chef. And when they cook and they prepare the food together, and they make this meal together, they can create these incredible feasts by learning off of each other and making something that everybody can enjoy. Okay, any questions so far that I can answer, or should I go on? All right, I'm going to keep going. If you have a question, you can always hit the cue board, okay? All right, so what's the one that we see most often? And I think probably a lot of you already know the answer to that. But some rhetorical questions for you to also consider in your teaching practice is, what is it that you believe as an educator? How have you approached teaching, and what assumptions are you making about your students, especially with those three models, in light of these three models? Now, in the United States, there's been this large movement towards what's called the Common Core standards. And the idea behind the Common Core is that all students will graduate high school with the same knowledge and understandings for math and English language arts. There's also another set of standards called the Next Generation Science Standards, which covers the scope of science in K through 12. Okay, now, mind you, and I'm just going to point this out, when you visit the website, the Common Core State Standards website, you'll notice that it says teachers were involved in the development of these standards. However, I do want to point out they were involved, but they never led in the development of these standards. Now, I want to just take the word standard and take you back to some of the characteristics of the industrial age. Standardization implies everybody is the same. It is also efficient because large groups can learn the same things at the same time with one instructor. It's also a way to teach conformity and compliance. But here's the problem. This was an educational movement in the 1950s when America had a need for manufacturing and assembly line workers. So what are we actually saying is that most teachers and most models of teaching are actually almost 50 years old when we talk about educational pedagogy. We don't need followers anymore, though. We don't need factory workers. In the information age, there's a huge push for innovators and leaders and collaborators. So some of the questions that we need to consider is how do we expect people to lead when our schools teach students to conform and follow? Where is it now in the curriculum where students learn to be leaders? How can we teach original thinking when everyone is expected to know and understand the same thing? Now, some of these questions can actually be answered by looking into modern learning theory. So, before I continue, go ahead, Star. What was your question?
Well, I was going to say, isn't leadership a personality trait, and isn't it really about learning how to deal with the people that have that particular learning trait, personality trait, because the general public are not leaders?
But
I'll
how
yield
do
the
you
mic.
know that? Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to continue? I'm sorry. Go
No, I
ahead,
said
Star.
I'll yield the mic. No.
Oh, okay. Well, here's the thing. We're assuming that, but yet, as a teacher, we always talk about critical thinking. We always talk about leadership opportunities and things like that, but these are not things that are taught in the classroom. What we do teach is what I would call normatives. In other words, you will sit at your desk, you will follow your teacher's instructions, and you will ask to go to the bathroom. You will follow, otherwise you will be punished. So maybe, and I'm just going to push the thoughts about this in a second here, maybe the reason why we have a nation of followers is because that's how we were taught in school, is to follow and not to lead. Nat, you want to go ahead?
Well, I was just thinking, I don't know. I'm not sure how to phrase this into a question, but I was thinking like, it's not only that we want them to lead others, but we want them to lead themselves, I would think, right?
Oh, yes.
Like, it's not just that we're hoping that they're going to be the next Steve Jobs. We're hoping that they might be the next innovator in whatever they're interested in. Am I right in that thinking that they're leading themselves education-wise, not necessarily just, I'm not articulating that very well. But.
No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think, and this goes back, I didn't write it in here because I wanted to kind of minimize the, the academic speak a little bit, but there's a thing, and actually you and I have talked about this before, called self-efficacy. And actually there's a lot of research in that, self-efficacy. And that basically means if somebody wants to pursue something, then they have the wherewithal, they have the motivation in order to do it. And I think that part, and again, this gets into a lot of politics and things like that. For the most part in education, that's not done. What ends up happening is, this idea that, students are going to go to school and they're going to be served this amount of information, and it's going to be the same information in the same portions for everybody. And I think the problem with that is now you've got students that are now passive, and they don't take the lead even in their own education. They don't speak up because that's not something that is taught, and it's not something that's encouraged. Yeah, exactly. It's not invested in the learning. Absolutely. So yeah. Should I continue? I don't think so, Star, because here's the thing. Not everybody is the same. So if we assume that we're giving everybody the same things, but everybody is actually different by nature, then you're actually creating an inequitable situation. That's the reason why, if we look at like those three pedagogical models, the generative and the transformative one are structured, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the talk, are structured in a way that it suits the individual needs of the people in your class. And by doing that, you're actually increasing self-efficacy and all of the other things. Anything else? I'm going to keep going. And then, like I said, if you have questions, just hit the cue board, and then I'll stop when I have a moment. Okay, so let's talk about learning theory, because that might kind of enlighten a little bit. Current learning theory is actually based off of three main historical roots: behavioralism, cognitive science, and constructivism. And I bet when I talk about behaviorism, people are really going to be, oh, yeah, because it's what our current education system is actually still based on. So let me talk about behaviorism. This was a theory, a body of study, okay, in the 1950s to the 1960s. And if some of you are familiar with Pavlov's dogs, you can understand the idea that these observable behaviors can be controlled by forming a connection between stimulus and response. So the idea here is we can shape somebody's behavior, somebody's learning, by shaping their external environment. In Pavlov's dogs, for instance, he taught them to drool by the sound of a bell. So when initially Pavlov would give the dog food and ring a bell at the same time. And then eventually what ended up happening is the dog made a connection between, oh, I hear a bell, that means food. So then later Pavlov removed the food, and whenever the bell was rung, the dog would continue to drool. It's the same thing. It's the same concept when a kid does well and you give them a sticker. Or when an entire classroom does well, they actually give them a party. Or when a kid doesn't do well, they send them to detention. So behaviorism is still very much ingrained in our schools, but there's a problem with that. Learning theory has actually changed, but teaching in some places hasn't. Now, cognitive science was developed in around the 1960s and the 1970s. And the difference is that in behaviorism, nobody cared what was going on in the person's head. All they cared about is the fact that if I change the environment, I'm going to get a change in the behavior. And if I change the environment in such a way, I can control this person's behavior. Cognitive science asked, what's happening in the head? Why is it if I give this person the stimulus, they'll do this behavior, but if I give a different person the same stimulus, the behavior changes? And what they found out is that there are physiological connections and experiential connections with somebody's prior experience, knowledge, and beliefs that change a person's behavior. In other words, learning conditions can influence the mental processing of somebody in different ways based on that individual. Okay? And I'm going to just give you a little bit of an example now, and then I'll talk about it later. For example, I have an aversion to portobello mushrooms. And one of the reasons why I have an aversion to portobello mushrooms is because I equate portobello mushrooms to snails, because I've eaten both and they kind of tasted the same, so I don't like either, and I won't touch any dishes with portobello mushrooms in them. And I'll explain why that's important in a second. Now, modern learning theory started to develop around the 1980s, and it's still kind of the ongoing popular theory right now. And the idea behind modern learning theory is constructivism, meaning knowledge and meaning are constructed through the learner's own prior experiences, understandings, and beliefs as they interact with the environment and they collaborate with others. In other words, we learn and we assimilate new experiences by interacting with other people and taking those new experiences and kind of gluing them to our own. Okay? Now, this is kind of an important thing, because what this means is that you can't treat learners in your classroom in the same ways. So let's look at learning theory now, and let's break it down, especially for people that are educators. This is probably where, they're going to be paying attention. The first principle behind current... Oh, thanks. Is that helping? I'm just toggling the mics. Yes, no, maybe?
Sounds like you need to reboot. That's doing that weird noise.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
no.
fuzzy.
Okay. All right, let me reboot, okay? I'm sorry.
Blah, blah.
Is that a little bit better?
Much better.
Here we go.
Oh, good. Okay, phew. Some technical difficulties. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody.
And it looks like it reset your slides.
Oh, no. Okay. Let me just... Oops. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's see, what slide am I on? That will probably help if I just go to the slide. 18. Sorry about that. It's probably reloading as we speak. Okay. Can everybody see that now? Hopefully? If not, it's also on the Google
Visiting.
Doc. Okay, great. Okay, talking about learning theory. Right. We have to assess what people know before they walk into the classroom, or I should say we have to assume that people already have pre-existing knowledge when they walk in. They already probably know a little bit or have assumptions about what you're going to be teaching. So it's really important as an instructor to take these understandings and build on them. Or if they're misunderstandings, then you've got to challenge them. And I told you about the portobello mushroom thing. If somebody offered me, if I walked into a classroom and they said, okay, we're going to cook a dish with portobello mushrooms in it, the first impression I'm going to say is, yeah, I don't like portobello mushrooms. I'm not going to like this dish. So we have to challenge that pre-existing knowledge first. Why don't you like mushrooms? This is what we're going to do to the dish, and this is how we're going to change the mushrooms in it. And if you don't like it, well, you can take the mushrooms out and you can have the dish this way. In some ways, education also can address those assumptions as well. What is it that students are coming in with? And then how do we have them look at it? And so learners need opportunities to uncover these pre-existing understandings, examine them, test them, and restructure them. And there's actually a number of pedagogical tools that can help you with that. But in other words, we want to somehow put them in this loop where students can reflect on their prior knowledge, look at the knowledge presented to them, revise it, and revisit it, and then reflect on it again. Okay, now learning theory 2 talks about how disciplinary knowledge is learned on a framework. Most of us already have this framework in mind, but the difference is that people that become experts at something have actually reorganized this framework so that the information is easily retrievable and it can be transferred to other contexts. So in other words, what distinguishes novice learners from experts is how this framework is organized into patterns so that this knowledge can be retrievable. Now, there was a study about this a couple years ago where they looked at expert chess players and novice chess players. Even though everybody knew the rules of the game, the question is, why is it that expert chess players played the game so much better than novice ones? And it turns out it's because expert chess players could see a board and recognize the patterns right away as the game was being played and knew how to react. Novice chess players had to practice over and over and over again and reorganize their conceptual framework before they got to the point where they could start winning games. So as instructors, you can consider our expert knowledge as ways to point out to people, look, have you seen this pattern? Have you looked at this concept? How do we build on these concepts to make sense? And where is it in those concepts that a learner is going to get stuck? And how do we design instruction in order to get them unstuck? So now the learning theory principle 3, and by the way, you'll notice that these 3 principles kind of overlap, is what's called metacognitive thinking, okay? And I know a bunch of you that know me hear me say it's on my meta all the time because it's really thinking about thinking and learning. That's what metacognition is, and that's what metacognitive is, okay? So in metacognitive approaches to learning, learners obtain the skills and tools to monitor their own progress and learning goals. And in doing so, this can really deepen the meaning-making process and actually help learners to transfer that knowledge to new settings, which is really what we want. So it really requires the instructor to help the student engage in reflection. And what's interesting is, one part of my job is actually doing evaluations of teachers in the classroom. And reflection is actually something that's very rarely seen in instruction. But I think asking students, what do I know about this before they begin? What do I need to know about this? And then later, how much do I know now are very important questions to help learners not only assimilate the information, but also think about how well they're assimilating the information. And this can actually add to self-efficacy. So in other words, provide learners with opportunities to engage in metacognitive conversations. Teach about the process in addition to the content. So learners need opportunities to reflect, predict, improve, plan, self-assess, evaluate, and teach. Provide formative assessments that can give feedback to both learners and instructors on how to adjust instruction. Now, as instructors, what do we do with this modern theory? Now that we know this is how people learn, we have to provide opportunities for learners to engage in active learning. Notice there's nowhere in learning theory where it says we need to transfer the knowledge to a learner. It doesn't work that way. Learners actually have to work with the information in order for it to become deeper, in order for it to become meaningful as well. So we have to provide these opportunities using our own pedagogical expertise to guide learners into building upon these concepts. This incorporation involves methods to promote active learning, like using discussion, reflection activities, assessment, and self-evaluations in order to make this learning meaningful to them. Incidentally, this photo is from the Science Stars program, which I actually used to manage when I was in Rochester. And so these are some of the students in the program. And as you can see, all three of them are actually engaged in the learning process. They're making films about science, incidentally. So now, in short, how does modern learning theory mesh with online or offline? The idea here is that your methods of teaching, including online tools, need to match up with your learning goals. Learning goals meaning the things that you want people to learn in your lessons. When we use online tools, we need to think about how they can be used for effective teaching, just like we would any other tools in our classroom. Some tools are better than others at accomplishing certain things and certain objectives. So, for example, I wouldn't use a book to try and present information for everyone in the classroom to see. I'd use a chalkboard for that. Here, it's the same thing. When we consider online tools, we have to consider, is this an effective use of this tool? And does it accomplish what I need it to accomplish? And are there other tools that can also be just as effective or less effective? So what's best for online? And I'm going to go through these a little bit slowly. By the way, I learned after the first run through of this, I'm going to actually break out this slide so that there's more examples of VWBPE. But for now, please, kind of go with me on this. So the first thing is that online is really great for bringing real-world problems to the classroom. And at the conference, you're going to actually be, inundated with great examples of how virtual education can be used to enhance online learning. For example, demos, simulations, video, connections to knowledge and resources. What these provide is the same kinds of information in multiple contexts, multiple forms, so that different learners can learn them in different ways. But the number one thing that online is really good for is interactivity, allowing people to interact with the environment. Okay? The other thing, and again, this is just in general for online, you can develop scaffolds to help structure and deepen metacognitive thinking. Modeling, for instance, is great online. Having students make videos and wikis to share, using online journals or discussion boards can help students reflect on their own thinking, and then if used in a peer environment, critique and reflect on other people's thinking as well. And going with that, the third point here is access and opportunities to connect with disciplinary experts and other learning communities. In Second Life, there are universities that teach language. Students come to learn English by inviting people from the community to just have a conversation with them. There's other things where, I've Skyped in professors when I've taught before from other colleges. So again, it's a very powerful tool, and we don't need to only think about virtual space, but we also need to think about other affordances that online can give, and connectivity is one of them. The other thing is it provides formative and summative feedback on what student learning and development is. Formative feedback, again, is like the process. It's like, I just realized that some of you may not understand what formative feedback is. Formative feedback is like if you're cooking a soup, while you're adding the ingredients, you taste the soup to make sure it tastes okay. So in learning, in doing a lesson, you include these formative feedbacks of how am I doing? How are you doing? What help do you need? Those are little feedback cues to let the student know if they're on the right track. Summative feedback is your typical test. It's when the lesson is all done. Here's my test, and this is what you get out of it. As you can see, formative feedback is a little more powerful. In an online setting, depending on the tools that you use, it can be very powerful for students to be able to monitor their thinking. Electronic portfolios, right off the top of my head, are a good example of this. We talked about this before. There's opportunities for collective collaboration as well as independent work. And then lastly, which I think is one of the most powerful pieces to online education, is that it can extend the classroom beyond physical time and space. In other words, you get more instructional time, but you also get more learning community time when you can take what you've taught in the classroom and move some of those components to online spaces. Are there any questions I can answer for anybody right now? I hear typing. Hi, Explorer. No? I'm going to go ahead and continue then. No worries at all. I'm just glad you're here. Oh, I hear somebody's mic. Anybody have a question?
Oh, sorry, I didn't know I had my mic on. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. No problem. All right. So, I'm going to give you one very common model that's used in online instructional design, especially for people that are looking to maybe improve on what they're doing online, or people that are looking to even design online classes. The community of inquiry model is actually really common. And the whole idea, the real, bird's eye view of this is that by including three components, social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence, you create this supportive community where students are able to find the resources that they need in order to learn. Okay. Now, online, like I said before, lends itself to creating really strong communities and for developing strong relationships because of its unique ways to communicate and collaborate. So we can use online tools to help align our teaching towards the information age where sharing, communication, and collaboration are most sought after right now. Like I said, the community of inquiry model, and you can see the citation on that, and Garrison will actually point you to a bunch of other citations about this and instructional design models, by the way. There's three main components that we have to consider in this model. And as an instructional designer, it's nice to actually think, okay, have I included something that includes social presence? And what social presence means in the the red square there, is that it introduces the human aspect into the digital space. As we know from examples of cyberbullying, it's really common for people to forget the human behind the screen. So incorporating opportunities for people to be human not only facilitates relationship building within the online space, but now people can bring in ideas of their own and personalities of their own as well. A quick example of this is just even asking people to write an introduction to themselves that incorporates, some sort of personal aspect, like what's your favorite ice cream? What are things that you like to do? So that you and others can learn more about the people behind the screen. Second Life, and I'm going to talk about Second Life in the next slide, actually can lend itself very easily with the use of avatars and profile personalization. The second component is the teaching presence, which addresses your role as the facilitator and the instructional designer. What kinds of instructional activities will you incorporate in your class? And how will the organization and design of these, such as online journals, discussion forums, and even tutorials, help promote collaboration and content? That's really what the teacher presence is about. And then the cognitive presence talks about how you organize your concepts in a way that can be easily learned. And this is a huge distinction because, people always say, well, you're a professional, so can't you teach it? And actually the answer is no. Because a professional educator knows how to teach the the concepts in a way that is easily assimilated and learned by a learner, whereas simply a professional knows what their content is, but not necessarily how they teach it. So cognitive presence is important because it's inquiry-based. Students get opportunities to look at their own thinking about things, and then they have activities that build upon their thinking in a unique way that allows for recall and transferability. Okay, so let's talk about virtual space. So one form of online education is Second Life, and of course we have an entire conference on that. So in this slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the advantages about this specific tool in education, which is Second Life. Now, keep in mind, there's actually several virtual worlds that provide spaces for virtual education, and you're probably going to attend several talks that talk about that at the conference. So, you know, there's going to be really good examples of those. Here, I'm going to just stick with Second Life with the understanding that some of these can be transferred. Okay. First, like I said before, there's that social presence, which can be easily achieved using avatars, like my owl here, profiles, and a variety of ways that you can communicate within the virtual world, such as instant messaging, group chats, and group notices. Second, the immersive environment allows for the transfer of culture and physical representations of the real world using physical, spatial, and visual components that enrich and enhance the learning community. For example, and you can see the picture here, and Stephen is actually in the audience, by the way. This is one of his classes that he teaches in Second Life. And as you can see by the environment, he's brought his real-world students into the classroom here, and it's a very immersive environment. It's a very comfortable environment where students can sit and talk and learn. So you can really easily recreate a space where students can feel very comfortable and familiar. Okay, and then third, Second Life runs in real time, just like how all of you are here at the talk, and it's running real. It's what's called synchronous. Not only this, but we can collaborate in this space, we can build in our environment, we can interact with our world. Additionally, Second Life has asynchronous, in other words, where times are mismatched, and they allow for ways of communication that way too, such as note cards, slides, offline instant messages, and group notices. These modes of communication offer a lot of flexibility, and it allows learners to receive instant feedback on their learning. Can I go on, or did anybody have questions? Okay, I'm going to continue. So what can hinder online? Negatively, namely, this thing called cognitive overload. And I think the picture kind of speaks for itself. Learners can only master so much at a given time. So if they're new to an online space, regardless of whether it's a Blackboard space, a news forum, Second Life, they have to not only learn the content that you want them to learn, but they also have to learn the computer program, the formatting, how to navigate the space. In other words, you're really asking them to learn a lot more than just the content at a given time. So time has to be given for the student to learn this environment. So it's really important as the instructor to be organized and to explicitly teach this organizational system in ways that students can easily navigate your course, very similar to how you would teach the actual content. I'm going to just touch up on some various ways to do this, but you can include video tutorials, face-to-face synchronous sessions, written tutorials, etc. You need to give students access to these resources, but also it's important to give them time to acclimate. So it may take longer to get to the content while students adjust to these different programs, formats, and so on. Hence, the presentation of content may be slower initially until students get into things. However, there are a lot of studies that show that when instructors take the time to orient students to the online environment, And they've sequenced and selected tools to match their instruction to create that community of inquiry model that I talked about. The learning can be far, far more meaningful and relevant. Yeah, Star, you had a question?
Yeah, when you use these programs like that you're when you're using these programs that I see you use online where you're actually making spreadsheets or documents in real time and people are watching you do it, because I've seen you being, as you prepare for these meetings, do that.
Yep.
Isn't that a standard tool, so that if you wanted to do that with a student in another college, would you expect that you would have to teach them this software because they would probably be using some other software?
They might,
Isn't there
yeah.
standard?
No, there's not. So yes, in fact, I have to tell you, in my online class, we had to spend an entire week on orienting everybody to Google Doc, to Google Documents, so that we could collaboratively work with each other on slides and presentations and things like that. The thing is, we assume that people come in with this knowledge, and what, especially in online, and somebody actually asked me this before, I think Rick asked me this before, the mixture of students are not just typical. So you have people very similar to a population at MOMS from all different ages and abilities and levels. And so in the beginning, when we have these online tools, not everybody's going to know how to use them. And so we have to be able to allot some time in order for people to learn how to use them initially and feel comfortable about it. So, yeah.
Just commenting. Did you see that, Blue? Really?
Oh.
I've been working countless hours and probably deleted probably 1,000 slides.
Oh,
You were right.
Explorer. Yeah, it takes a while to learn, right? So
as you go and you learn, it makes the learning curve hard.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so I think one of the caveats, and we learned this in our online classes, and some of my classmates actually ran into this when they started their own online programs, is that, we have to at least provide opportunities and tutorials and plenty of just scaffolds to make sure that everybody is comfortable using the tools for online. So yes, just like what Natalia is saying, is Google Docs and Drive takes a while to use, but also if you're going to have those tools used in your online classroom, you have to provide scaffolded opportunities for them to be used. Like, for example, the first time I was introduced to Google Doc was in a meeting, and everybody walked me through, okay, you're going to go here, you're going to go onto this document, let me send you the link to the document, and now you're going to be the one writing the meeting notes, and we'll just help you fill in the spaces. So this is something that, as an instructor, you need to think about, is like, okay, if I expect them to use this, how am I going to, ease them into using these things? So as Explorer said, the learning curve is not so steep. So yeah, that's a really good point there. Okay. Other questions, or can I go on? Yeah, and it's just like what Nat says. There are different, now PowerPoint, you know what, we can talk about that later. There is a way to actually edit and things like that, but if you're uploading them straight, they actually upload as a PDF. So you actually have to create the PowerPoint on Google Doc in order for it to be modifiable. And, that's one of those things, right? As an instructor, I just realized, wow, I probably didn't show you how to do that. So, as an instructor, you kind of learn as you go along with these tools too. So, so we talked about cognitive overload, being very conscious about what people are learning. Because they can learn too much. And then the other thing is, and I love this classic example of texting and driving at the same time, technology can be used inappropriately, right? So think about texting while you're driving. Texting is a great technological tool. It's just not a tool that you want to use when you're driving, because it can cause distractions, right? And then there's other things that should be used at that moment. In other words, your technology is operating your car, not learning how to text at that point. So make sure the technology fits the learning goal. Okay. For example, in some of my research, there's been papers that describe the use of Second Life in education. Now, there's been really great papers, and that's some of the stuff that I talked about before about using Second Life. But there's also some papers that report Second Life as being very difficult and a failure. And one of the most common threads that I found among those papers is that people assumed I can take everything in my classroom, all of the instructional design right now that I do face to face, and just bring it to the virtual world. Just, piece for piece, everything is alike. And so moving the lecture classroom from a physical space to a virtual one is not an efficient way of teaching the content. Because, and I'll talk about this in a moment, you're going to bring in a whole host of other things that you have to address along the way. But the first one is teaching the tool so that it is appropriate to what you want them to learn. So an example is if instead of having students just come to a lecture, some of the more powerful ways of using Second Life would be studying a 3D model or working and interacting with students from all over the world, right? Or like in this case, people from all over the world can come to a talk like this and learn more about online education. So Second Life may better fit the needs of one type of learning objective as opposed to the other. But we shouldn't just throw out face-to-face instruction just because we think that this is the new hot and trendy thing. It's really important as instructors that we balance the costs and benefits of each instructional tool, just like we do our physical tools in the classroom. Okay, so now I'm going to just talk about some possible barriers, and I actually changed the slide a little bit for VWBPE. Because these are barriers that you can encounter in Second Life, especially for those of you that might consider Second Life as a place to teach. Some things to consider, and I'm sure Stephen can even add to this when I'm done. But the first is the technical part. There's a really high demand for good equipment and internet connections when you start with Second Life. And it's coupled with, just like what Explorer said, a very steep learning curve in order to manipulate your environment as well as just your avatar getting around. So what this means is that you may have a group of students, but their systems can slow them down. And you have to take that into consideration. Everybody may not have computers that are strong enough to handle, say, an environment where there's more than 5 people or something. So, like I said, there's probably people here who have taught in virtual environments, and they can probably offer a lot of suggestions on how to address the technical aspects of this. Secondly, there is this issue of identity, culture, and communication. If you're teaching in Second Life, there's a bit of a culture shock involved, and I'm sure for a lot of Second Lifers here, you can totally get what I mean, because your students are going to be exposed to the public. From my experience, this is not a good place. It's not very ideal for minors because you are encountering all kinds of people from everywhere. And sometimes this is not so easily controllable here. However, even adults still will need time to get used to things such as how to communicate, how to move around, and get a little bit of a feel for the culture of Second Life. And I can give you an example. Some of you were here when this happened. When I brought my instructor here, one of my advisors here for the very first time, after we debriefed on that experience, he actually said to me, he's like, I kept getting distracted by the avatar next to me. It was actually one of Steven's talks here at Mom's. And, he was telling me, he's like, they had a tail and ears, and I couldn't figure out whether or not they wanted to be a cat or a squirrel or something. And then their things on them like twitched. So he says, so I was distracted and I didn't pay attention to that part of the lecture. And that could very well be. You have to give them time to acclimate and kind of discover their identity and things like that in Second Life. Third, and we mentioned this before, it's important to give people time to learn the viewer and to get used to the virtual environment. You have to, as an instructor then, include this in your instructional design You have to allow for this time, but also allow for opportunities for learners to practice these new skills on top of what the actual disciplinary content is. A really good example of this is there's a paper that talks about how they were really successful in creating art, having students create expressive art in Second Life. And the first assignment that they start out with is actually making a turtle using just basic building blocks found in Second Life.
Now,
and once they
where
were
if you
able to
expect
create
somebody
the
to be a
turtle,
leader,
it was almost
and,
like
not
a
just
bridge
leading people,
to learning
that's
everything else.
not exactly what I mean. I mean,
So you have to,
taking a
again,
lead in
just
even
like
your own
regular
education,
content, you
being
have to think
proactive,
about
speaking up and
scaffolds
things like that.
when
You
you're considering
almost have
online
to shake up
going into
this
Second Life.
philosophy that
Now,
students come in with.
economics
empty
is
minds.
another consideration.
You know,
Second Life, especially for
if we
teachers,
stop treating
well,
them
especially
as
for anybody,
consumers
it's not
and
necessarily
instead
free.
treat them as chefs,
If you're going to teach, it
I think you're
costs
gonna see a
money in
big
order to find the
difference
land
in
to
how these
teach,
students
unless you have a
react
campus
to
that's
that
already
kind of
there.
education.
There's issues about accessibility, avatar customization, hiring people,
So, yeah.
and that costs money too, to build your
Any other
campus or your
questions
virtual
people
classroom.
had or anything?
So think about that.
And I was
There's
just
a
about
lot of
to say,
networking
both
that goes
Stephen
on
and
at
Peace are
BWBPE
educators,
that can
and they
help
both
facilitate that. There's
do
probably
virtual
people that can
worlds,
host
so you can always
classes
pick their
and
brains
things like
too
that,
and ask them
but
stuff.
that
So I'm
requires a lot
just
of
learning
a lot
all
of
of this.
research.
Yeah,
They're
start,
talking about here, in fact,
they're
is a place where you can
well-worn
do that. So
veterans when it
again,
comes
though,
to
you
teaching
have
in
to
virtual
take a
worlds.
lot of
So,
these things into
you know,
consideration.
it's
In other
so
words,
great to have them
learn
here because
your
they can also
environment
give
a
you
little
input
bit
too.
first.
And just like what Matt said,
Before
she
you
sent out an
throw
info
all your
card and
students.
feedback card. So if you want to just rip me apart and you don't want to do it to my face, just do it on the card and give it to Nat. She will not tell me who sent the card. But I really do need to hear the feedback, please, because it's very helpful to me. So yeah.
If you didn't get those cards, you can click the board beside the podium and it'll be delivered to you. And so, geez, I'm glad to hear that Peace is an educator and wants to know when we can expect you to book your next lecture here at Mom's. Like finding little nuggets when I find educators.
You're going to go to a conference where there might be 4,000 of them, Explorer.
Yep.
Just letting you know.
Deliriously drunk with the idea of it all.
Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah, go for it, Stephen.
At least in the K through 12 space, there are several challenges that schools and districts face. One, continually decreasing real budgets, increasing time demands on instructors, faculty, teachers, and in many cases, a reticence to try something new. And of course, the other, I'm not against many of the principles of Common Core, but one of the concurrent features of it is this emphasis on standardized testing. So given those challenges, how would you best advocate for the use of virtual worlds for creating these pedagogical styles that you're mentioning? How would you make the case that that's something that you need to do given those challenges?
That's a really good question. And what's really interesting is, I'm still actually involved in a lot of science teacher training at the University of Rochester. And so we have these students that come in, master students that train to become teachers. And they ask that all the time. There's this tension, this very awful tension about how do we teach to these standards, yet give students enough time to assimilate what they need to assimilate. I would say part of it is disrupting this assumption that students come in with empty heads. Talking about starting, using a starting point of, my students know something and what I want to do is have them know it a little more deeply. And giving that sort of reasoning to parents and educators in the beginning. And
I say that because when I taught biology at the high school, my biology classes were very different, although I think every student that was in them could say they were extremely challenging than the typical sit and lecture type of style. And